Welcome back. Welcome back to the Racial Draft Podcast. I am your host, Michael Ford, doing what we do every week, and that is change the complexion of the racial, change the complexion of the comic universe one draft pick at a time. How did I mess up my own catchphrase? Oh, it's because it's late. Uh, those of you in podcast land, you may be listening to this first thing in the morning, but it is in the early AM for me. But I don't sleep because I need to stay up all night recapping round five of the racial draft, round five of season seven. So let's kick it right off with the first pick of the round, and that would be Kate Bishop. Kate Bishop, who was drafted by the South Asian delegation. Um, the pick was kind of cool. Not too much to say about it, about the pick. There was a fan cast that I will mention in just a second. That would be Alia Bhatt, whose work I'm not that familiar. I think she's a Bollywood actress. Like I said, I'm not familiar with her work. In the discussion of what making Kate Bishop something other than white would entail. I mean, I don't think it changes a ton. Obviously, a big part of her story is having a lot of money. So the key for her is however she grew up with a certain amount of financial privilege, um, which doesn't necessarily extend to racial privilege. If you throw enough dollar signs, into the equation with the Bishop family, you can definitely have a character who is a little bit disconnected from everyday life and is a little more happy-go-lucky until superheroics kind of introduce realism into her story. But obviously, we have seen the extent to which in live action, her being white passing, uh, you know, if not white in the comics, for instance, has made that storytelling a lot easier. So for that reason, I sort of understand why what we're looking at in terms of approval from the audience is a little on the low side. We're looking at a 69.2% approval rating for South Asian Kate Bishop, with 61.5 strongly approve, 7.7% somewhat approve, 7.7 somewhat disapprove, and 23.1% racist. As far as the fan cast, slightly better. 71.4% approval rating for the fan cast, 57.1 strongly approve, 14.3 somewhat approve, 21.4 somewhat disapprove, and 7.1 strongly disapprove of the fan cast. Um, you know, um, it's I you know like I said before, I think that people have a vision of what Kate Bishop is that may not jibe with either the racial draft pick or the fan cast. Speaking of not always jibing with the racial draft pick or the fan cast, the Polynesian delegation, who kind of went outside the box this time out, and they drafted Loki Laufesen. Obviously, one thing that uh, particularly with the Norse mythology characters, they're so typically associated with whiteness. We talked about it a little bit a few rounds back when we talked about Thor, but at least with Loki, you do have a character who is a shapeshifter, and he's also a god who isn't necessarily part of the Asgardian line in the sense of being, um, you know, being Odin's son. The story of him actually being a frost giant and taking on that form does kind of give a little bit more leeway for Loki to be depicted as something other than a white man. And then, when you introduce the element of him feeling like an outcast, maybe he's an outcast because he's got brown skin. It's a possibility. So to that end, it does open a little bit more leeway from a storytelling perspective to have Loki depicted as Polynesian. I'd love to hear from Tomati with respect to specifically how Polynesian identity would be uh, infused into the character, if at all. So hopefully when if we can get Tommy on the show, we can talk about some of the picks that he's made thus far and whether some of these characters would have those cultural elements. Um, as far as there was a fan cast chosen here, and that was a Maori actor Jordy Weber, another actor whose work I'm not particularly familiar with. So we're dealing with a little bit more on the low end in terms of the approval. 71.4% approval for Polynesian low key and 40% approval. Sorry, 42.9. Let me get the exact percentage right. 42.9% approval rating, all strongly approving of Jordy Weber as low key. So did not go over. But let's move on to the third pick of the round, and that pick comes from the Swana Mena delegation, and they chose Lex Luthor. Now, the thing about Lex is that I think that a lot of people do think of Lex's story as being primarily a white man's story, but it doesn't have to be. I don't think. I mean, I think that if you imagine a character who um, sees himself as a self-made man and sees himself as having made it, you can imagine the lens of his resentment for Superman um, being manifested a little bit differently if he's a man of color, and he's had to encounter microaggressions in his life, but he's managed to rise above and he's been able to become a very powerful person, only to see a Superman, a uh, being of alien, uh, you know, DNA with superpowers and the like, being worshipped. And I could see how his desire to one might call an inferiority complex, but just really a desire to have his accomplishments be celebrated and lauded. Could there could be another layer there when you're dealing with a person of color. I think it could work. Unfortunately, the people disagree with me because, by the time you listen to this podcast, the polls would have closed. So right now, the polling here is at 50% approval rating, 33.3 strongly approve, 16.7 somewhat approve, 16.7 somewhat disapprove, and 33.3 strongly disapprove of Swana Lex Luthor. And it's a shame, because I rather like the fan cast of Tahar Rahim. You might have seen him in, I believe the name of the show was Serpent. You will also be seeing him in Madam Web because he was in the Amazon with the main character's mother when she was worshiping spiders right before she died. So clearly he's got a penchant for playing villains. He's very charming actor as well. I think he could actually do a very good job in the role. So as of now, 59 point. Oh, wait, sorry, 57.2% approval rating for Tahar Rahim as Lex Luthor, with 42.9 strongly approve, 14.3 somewhat approve, 14.3 somewhat disapprove, and 28.6 racist. But we'll keep it moving. We will do what we have to do um, in the face of these low scores, and we will move ahead to the white delegation, fresh off of losing their challenge, and therefore the White Panther is no more. The White Panther has been blocked via challenge, and the black delegation has successfully repossessed, as it were, T'Challa. So there's a victory for Black History Month, and but undaunted, the white delegation has decided to draft Jean Grey. So that is a traditionally white character. Who among us would object to Jean Grey remaining white? There's too much of her story that resonates and codes her as a woman of color. But I mean, I'm surprised at this number though. I am deeply surprised at this number. 33.3% approval rating for still white Jean Grey. I mean, I'm a little bit dumbfounded. We're talking about low scores, low approval ratings, and this has been the lowest of all, and this is a quote unquote defensive pick. So perhaps more Black history get back is afoot. But again, I should have mentioned this before, but there are a number of places that you can vote in our polls. One of them is Twitter. You know, the place with the X that's still called Twitter. You can also vote on our main website, racialdraft.com. And you can also occasionally cast your votes on threads, Instagram threads. And follow us in all the places. Follow us on all of those sites, and also follow us on YouTube, where you can see our rounds in review, and occasionally me. But why would you want to do that? Honestly, audio's where it's at. Audio podcasts on all your places where you get audio podcasts. We will continue, and where we're going to go, nobody knows, except there's like a list. And that brings us to the multiracial delegation. And they went ahead and drafted a pretty popular multiracial character, that character being Miguel O'Hara, aka Spider-Man 2099, canonically Mexican and Irish, thus the name mashing together a Miguel and an O'Hara. He was introduced to the masses in Across the Spider-Verse, well performed by Oscar Isaac, and for that reason, Oscar Isaac was chosen as the live action fan cast. And there's some positivity. 77.8% approval rating for still multiracial Miguel O'Hara. All 77.8 strongly approve, and 11.1 somewhat disapprove, and 11.1 racist. As far as the fan cast of Oscar Isaac, like I mentioned, 80% strongly approve. Sorry, 80% approval, with 70% strongly approve, and 10% somewhat approve, 10% somewhat disapprove, and 10% people who hate Oscar Isaac, who, again, racist. But yeah, there's not a lot to say about that. I mean, it's already part of a story. It doesn't particularly change. So yeah, we'll keep going. We'll stay the course. Another defensive pick, speaking of staying the course, is the East Southeast Asian delegation, who drafted Cassandra Cain. One of we could definitely get into a longer discussion about her role, and how there are some tropey elements to the character, with respect to her being a largely nonverbal martial artist. They have tried a little bit to take steps to move her away from that trope. I know that one of the things that the Birds of Prey movie got dinged for is having a depiction of Cassandra Cain that maybe in the eyes of some went too far away from the trope, and having martial arts not even be a big part of her character. But she had a lot more personality, so that ended up being the trade-off there. But yeah, all in all, it's important to have Cassandra Cain be East or Southeast Asian, and therefore the delegation went ahead and claimed her. And weirdly enough, still less than 100% approval, 81.8% approval for Cassandra Cain being kept by the East Southeast Asian delegation. There was a fan cast whose work, this is a repetitive trend. Sorry to say, Lukita Maxwell is the fan cast for Cassandra Cain. 81.8% approval rating for her fan cast, with 72.7 strongly approve, 9.1 somewhat approve, 9.1 somewhat disapprove, and for sure 9.1% racist, disapproving of the fan cast. So we'll keep it going. We are just motoring through. We're at the seventh pick of the round, and that's the Jewish delegation. And they've drafted Tim Drake, who, as my understanding, is not canonically Jewish, but he could be. So kind of a safe pick. You know, the Robins are always out and about, always kind of doing their thing in the DC world. You know, Batman's got a lot of stories, and he hangs out with his Robins all the time. I think at this point, Tim Drake spends a lot of time hanging out with Dick Grayson, Nightwing, and earlier on in the draft, the Jewish delegation drafted Dick Grayson. So you know that bodes well for you know, an affinity between these two characters. You know, if one of them were Jewish and the other one were Jewish, they would have that to bond over. So that's kind of cool. So as of now, we are looking at 75% approval rating for Jewish Tim Drake, and 62.5 strongly approve, 12.5 somewhat approve, 12.5 somewhat disapprove, and 12.5% anti-Semitic. Yeah, I said it. You know, it's a shame. It's a shame that anti-Semitism even comes to the racial draft. Very, very disappointing. Once again, there's, you know, with these later characters in the round. By the time you hear this podcast, you can get your voices in there, and you can cast your votes for these characters, whether you approve of them as racially drafted or not. The reason I'm saying that is because we're about to get to one of the more controversial picks, not in my eyes, but I would imagine in the eyes of many, and that would be Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, drafted by the Black delegation. Now, I've said many times before that I do think that there's something that would be a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more to give Scott Summers a little bit more pathos if he were a person of color, in part because a lot of his characteristics, his overachiever characteristics, can be better understood, and they can better fit within the personality type of someone who believes that his only method of gaining acceptance is being an overachiever. You know, one of the kind of old school things that Black people were taught traditionally is that you have to be twice as good and only get half the credit. If you adhere to that notion, if you adhere to the idea of having to be twice as good, then you can imagine how that can animate a Black Cyclops's desire to be the best X-Man, the best leader, the best and most prepared of all of Xavier's students, and especially given the level to which he embraces Xavier's dream. You know, I think that one way to take him out of the sort of quote unquote Boy Scout white guy overachiever trope is to introduce that element of why it is that he feels like he has to be the best at everything, or be his best at everything, and hold back all of his flaws and repress all of his darkness in order to uh, prosper. I think that having a character of color, particularly a black man, having to embody those that pathos is probably a better way of saying what I was trying to say. Um, those burdens, I think that that could really work well. But again, sadly, the masses don't share my vision. So we are looking at 57.1% approval rating. So that is a 42.9 strongly approving, 14.3 somewhat approving, and 42.9% somewhat disapproving. But no strong disapproval. So that's something. As far as the fan cast that was chosen for Scott Summers, Mason Gooding, who you might know from the most recent Scream movies, and also from being Cuba Gooding Jr.'s son. So 66.6, 66.7, as it were, approval rating for his fan cast, basically 2/3, and a third disapproving with 22.2, somewhat disapproving, and 11.1 racist. Let's keep it moving though. We're getting into the final two picks of the round and moving past Scott Summers from the Black delegation to the Latinx delegation as they basically snatched a Black character, not fully snatched this Black character, but at least took the character away from the Black delegation. And that would be Eric Brooks, aka Blade, one of the more high profile Black characters. You know him as being made famous by Wesley Snipes, and he will, of course, be portrayed in the MCU at some point in the future by Mahershala Ali, noted non Latino. But as is their wont, the Latinx delegation has chosen Afro Latino depiction of Blade. So there's that. Now, it's a little bit interesting given that Blade, canonically in the comics, grew up in England in like the 1800s. That isn't to say that there wouldn't be, um, you know, Afro Latino uh, people, Afro Latinx people in England. I'm sure there were some from the Caribbean, but I would say that based on the time frame, that in the time frame they would have just been seen as Black. But it doesn't mean that later in life. That doesn't mean that later in life Blade couldn't have traveled to the land of his ancestors and and gained more cultural identity. So I'm very curious to hear what the Latinx delegation will be doing as far as fleshing out this interpretation of Blade. I do like the fan cast. Yolande Noel, you might know from the first Purge. Very good actor, very good action chops. He would have been a fine Blade if he was chosen. He would be a fine addition to the MCU in any kind of form, as far as I'm concerned. But again, kind of controversial. So the pick of Latino Blade, only 50% approval rating, with only 10% strongly approving and 40% somewhat approving, with full 20 somewhat disapproving and 30% strongly disapproving of a Latino Blade. Is that might be racist? It might be. And as far as, like I said before, Yolande Noel, his approval rating is quite high. It is actually 72.7 approval for the fan cast. So there's that, and 18.2 strongly approve, 54.5 somewhat approve, 18.2 somewhat disapprove, and 9.1%. You heard it, racist. And that brings us to the final pick in in the fifth round, the Native American delegation. Uh, I'm pretty sure it's going to be a set, um, one of brother and sister duo within the first family. So who better than some of the first people in the Americas than to embody two members of the first family? And the first one would be Susan Storm, the Invisible Woman. I think that obviously there's a lot of coding of her as a character, as a traditional sort of 1960s housewife. The fact that she is blonde uh, kind of undercuts the way that she's coded for sure. But that isn't to say that there aren't Native women who would embody that um, image. Um, particularly, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of an outside the box choice, but it's not so outside the box that it feels like it couldn't work or it would somehow break the character. But if you feel otherwise, go ahead and share your comments. Email us at racialdraftpodcast@gmail, or like I said, comment on the podcast or comment on the on the social medias with your sense of why you don't think this character works. Because I'm looking at the numbers. The numbers are, we're at 50-50 right now with when it comes to Native American Sue Storm. Um, and as far as the fan cast of Koryanka Kilcher, we're a mere 28.6% approval for her. So, I mean, for whatever reason, people aren't seeing the Sue Storm vibe out of the fan cast for this actress. So yeah, I mean, I'd like to hear, we can talk about it. Obviously, next week we'll be talking about the sixth round, but the sixth round, spoiler alert, is also going to feature the Storms. And I think as a package deal, I think that there's a way to um, kind of think of the Storms is slightly different from what they have been traditionally depicted as, without losing the essential elements of the character. Even Sue Storm is a character that has evolved over time as as attitudes around women, particularly in the context of marriages. As those attitudes have evolved, so also has the Sue Storm character, to the point that most people, when they think about Sue Storm now, comic readers, as it were, when they think about her, they think about how fierce she is and how strong she is. When early on, she was very much the uh, damsel, even though her powers were still the powers that they were. So, I think that as she, um, you know, as the character is more is better understood to be powerful, if not outright independent. I think that does open up the coding to be something less than the sort of traditional blonde housewife figure. So that's the argument for Sue Storm. Us to sort of expand our thinking when it comes to Sue Storm and have her not just fall into the plain white trope. I say all this even knowing that in the coming weeks/months we're going to actually get a casting for Sue Storm in the MCU, and chances are it's going to be a white woman. But that's kind of how things shake out. This is one of the reasons why we have the racial draft, so that we can kind of imagine a different world, and think through the ramifications or the possibilities. As I often say, the possibilities are wider than you might expect when it comes to the racial draft. So I'm going to leave it here. Very very abbreviated show. But hopefully we get a little bit more feedback. Hopefully we can get your votes on the various platforms. I'll say it again, racialdraft.com is the main mothership site. But you can subscribe on YouTube. You can subscribe on your podcast platforms. You can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Threads. Where else? TikTok. Yeah. We're ticking and we're talking. I've never felt as old as when I just said that. Wow. Wow. That's crazy. But yeah, go ahead and join us and participate in our discussions about the intersections of race and comics. Don't have much else to say, so I'll say this: all things are possible.